Welcome back to the Snowpoint Cast. Today we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to be doing a shuffling tutorial. So when we're doing the shuffling tutorial, the main reason that we're going to be doing this is so that more people know what effective shuffling looks like. And when I say effective shuffling, I mean when you're shuffling your deck, your goal should be to randomize it effectively in the lowest amount of time possible. And the methods that I'm going to talk about today definitely do that. It's really important to have a low shuffle time, especially if you play in standard. Like if you're playing in a real tournament, you're given a best of 3 50 minutes. So if you're spending a ton of time shuffling in between the rounds, then that's time that you could potentially be playing a game. So that's why shuffling quickly is important. So let's get into it. So the first method we're going to talk about is the Overhand Riffle. So the Overhand Riffle is probably the most common method that I know. And a lot of people use the Overhand Riffle. It's definitely a good shuffling method. So what you do is you're going to take the deck, divide it in half, and then keep your hand, or the cards in your left hand, loose fitting. The ones on your right hand, keep it loose fitting as well, but it's more important to keep the ones in your left hand loose fitting. And then you're going to put them in at a 45-degree angle. And then once the corners are in, you're just going to kind of mesh the decks together. And then you just do that over and over. Be sure that you're mixing up, going in like, now the bottom card is the same, and now the top card is the same. Now the bottom card is the same, just so you're not ever accused of stacking. When you keep the bottom or top card the same, it's essentially cheating, so definitely do not do that. But yeah, so overhand riffling is really, really good. I just muscle memoried into the two-hand riffle, which is the next one we're going to talk about. I do really love this shuffle. So the two-hand riffle is a little bit different. What you're going to do is take your deck, divide it in half, and then you're going to take your index finger, and you're going to bend the deck a touch. So just the slightest bit, just enough that it's enough pressure that the cards will fall into one another. And then slowly let go with your thumb. So just like that. And it's a lot easier when you're using it down. So I just did that for an example, but you get it down, okay? And then the decks are meshed really well. And you have one of two options. You can kind of either just mash them together like that. But if you want to be even more time effective, you can bend them towards one another, like bend them in with your index fingers and hand, and that's kind of fun. I do really like doing that. So that's the two-hand riffle. The two-hand riffle is a solid shuffle method as well. It's probably my most common, and I think it's the fastest compared to the overhand. Like I can get in a bunch of two hands compared to doing overhand shuffles, and they are very random just because, you know, when you overhand shuffle, sometimes these cards, okay, this is a random overhand, okay? This huge clump of cards here didn't get randomized at all. These are 5 cards that are still the same. And I mean, it was, as you do more overhand shuffles, they get randomized. But even just like, you miss half of it here. This whole part of the deck isn't getting randomized now. So when you do the two-hand shuffle, it lets you really easily go, okay, I'm just gonna put, and now almost every single card has a card in between it. So that's kind of a nice part about the two-hand riffle, and I do like that does randomize it a touch better. And the next method we're gonna talk about is piling. So piling is a great shuffling method when paired with another method. If you see someone pile shuffling and they aren't doing another shuffle after, that person is likely stacking their deck. Because when you pile and you don't randomize after, you can have your deck in a certain order beforehand, and then you pile it, and technically you're not shuffling, you're organizing it. And the reason that you do pile is if you have, like, say these are all 3 the same card, now they're not going to be next to one another. So it keeps your deck from stacking, especially at the end of the game when you have a bunch of energies or Pokemon all clumped together. Piling lets you just say, I'm just going to make sure those are separate for sure. But do be sure to combine this with another method of shuffling. Just because if you pile and don't have another method of shuffling after, it's not actually random. You're actually just stacking at that point. So definitely be sure to combine that with another method. And there's lots of ways you can pile. I like to do it in 7 just because 7's a prime number and it just keeps them divided. Piling is great to count your deck too. You know, if you are playing with a 59 card deck, that's illegal against the rules. So if you do this at the beginning of a game, it just lets you count your deck as well. So yeah, piling is great. Really solid randomizing method, especially at the beginning of a game. If you had just like finished another game and all your Pokemon and energy cards are clumped together, it just like kind of declumps your deck before you shuffle it as well. So now we're going to talk about some not effective shuffling to look out for. So the first one is if you see someone overhand shuffling, definitely watch their eyes, because someone's eyes are watching their deck a lot, it's kind of suspect. So definitely be careful of that. And we're going to talk more about watching your opponent's eyes and where your eyes should be in a second. But so that's the first one, is just kind of watch out for that. But also watch out for the overhand stack, because the overhand stack is not actually a shuffling method. And I do know a lot of Japanese players use this method. So the overhand stack looks something like this. You put some cards here and then you shuffle them into one another like this. And it's actually not technically a shuffle. It does change the order of the cards in your deck, but if you overhand stack, so this is the top of your deck right now, right? If you do the overhand stack, then technically you're just reorganizing your deck. You're not actually technically shuffling. You're not randomizing the order of your cards. By definition, you're changing the order. So instead of being top to bottom, it's now bottom to top. And that's not actually shuffling. It's not an effective randomization. And it's really unfortunate too, because at the World Championship, so in 2016, I played at Worlds, and in Worlds, there's players from all over the world. So one of them that I was sitting next to was from Japan, and he actually got essentially a game loss. He didn't get a game loss per se, but when you're in the World Championships and you get a prize punishment that leads to a game loss, it's essentially a game loss. So anyway, he was doing the overhand stack that a lot of Japanese players do. And so he did the stack, and apparently the judge came up and he's like, hey man, like, I've already warned you that that's not an effective shuffling method, so I have to give you a prize penalty now. And that is the last place that you want a prize penalty, is at Worlds. If you're at the World Championship, you made it, right? Like, that's usually every player's goal throughout the season, is get an invite to Worlds. So when you get there, the last thing that you want is to get a prize punishment that leads to a game loss, that leads to you not doing as well at Worlds as you potentially could. So definitely don't use that method. I don't like this method at all. And watch out for it. If your opponent is using the overhand stack, I would shuffle their deck almost every time. Okay, so we're going to start talking about the eyes a little bit more. So it's really important to read your opponent's eyes, when they're shuffling. And this is the number one thing that I pay attention to when I'm shuffling, is I've been playing the game for long enough that I can shuffle effectively without thinking about it anymore. And as you shuffle more, you get to that point where you're just like, I can just effectively randomize my deck and think about other things and talk about other things while I'm doing that. But it's important to watch your opponent, because for one of two reasons. The first of which is they can be watching you, right? So if your opponent is cheating and they plan to stack their deck, they should be looking at you. So they look at you, and then when you're not paying attention, they should be paying good attention. When you're not paying attention, they'll do something shady with their list. So make sure that you're always focused on your opponent, and especially like your opponent's eyes and their deck when they're shuffling. Another bad place that their eyes can be is on their deck. So if you see someone shuffling like this, where their cards are kind of, you can kind of see the bottom of the cards a little bit. It's not technically random, because your opponent knows some order of what's in their deck. And if they're watching their deck all the time, it's not bad to say something about it. Be like, hey man, like, you don't need to be looking at your deck that much. Or like, I don't understand why you're looking at your cards and your deck is like this. Like, you can be non-confrontational about it, but you can also just be like, I don't want to have to call a judge based on your mediocre randomization. So just don't look at your deck. And that's a really important aspect of watching your opponent's eyes when you're playing, just because, especially with the state of the game right now, like, there's so much money on the line at every event. The amount of cheating has gone up a lot. So just be watching where your opponent's eyes are. And I'm going to talk about a method that you can kind of stop others from thinking that you have suspect eyes, because sometimes when you're shuffling your deck, you just like don't think about it, and then you're like, oh, I'm looking at my deck. Look at my deck, I'm shuffling. And then you see this bottom card and you're like, oh, whatever, it's no big deal. I'm just going to randomize some more. But you shouldn't even know what that card is. You shouldn't even know that card is in a certain order in your deck. You shouldn't know that at all. So I would recommend something that I'd like to call the Ninomura Method. So Tyler Ninomura is a player from the Pacific Northwest, really solid dude, really good player as well. And he has this shuffling method. I saw him do this at Seattle Regionals in 2017, and I loved it. So what he does is he'll shuffle his deck, but his eyes will be, he'll look up. So like, he'll look directly up. And partially, I don't like this method because when you do look straight up, it stops you from looking at your opponent's eyes and your opponent's deck. So I'm not a huge fan of that. But I've modified the Ninomura method where I like looking above my opponent's head, right? Because if you're looking up, you can't be looking at your own cards, and then there's no way they can accuse you of cheating because they're like, oh well, yeah, I don't think your deck's random. You're like, man, my eyes have been looking up this entire time. Like, what are you talking about? So I do really like that method, and definitely something that, you know, if you're not looking at your deck, there's no reason to be looking at your deck. Yeah, unless you're like a new shuffler. If you're new at shuffling, then you have an excuse to look in your deck. But if you've been playing in the game for a while, you literally have no excuse. So I would definitely recommend keeping an eye on your opponent's eyes when you're shuffling, and just knowing, trying to know what your opponent's thinking about when they're shuffling. Like, a lot of the times you can get a read on an opponent if they're like shady or not. Like, a lot of the times if I'm playing against someone and I think they're cheating against me, I can tell almost right away, just because of how people act when they're up to something devious. But yeah, this has been a shuffling tutorial. If you have any questions about shuffling or any other methods, definitely feel free to leave it in the comments, and I'll do my best to get back to them. But yeah, thanks so much for tuning in.